There are moments in life that no one witnesses. No applause, no confirmation, no one standing next to you saying, "You did the right thing." Yet those moments quietly decide who you become afterward, not because something dramatic happened, but because of how you reacted when nothing went your way. It might have been late at night. Everything was quiet. And for the first time, you realized that if you broke one more time, you wouldn't come back as the same person. Most people, when pushed to that edge, collapse. Some turn bitter. Some become cold. Some give up on people, on meaning, on themselves. That reaction is normal, but not everyone reacted that way. Some people did something subtle, almost invisible. They didn't become heroes. They didn't suddenly feel strong. They simply refused to lose who they were, even when losing themselves would have been easier. If you've lived through a moment like that, and you know, quietly, that your response wasn't the obvious one, then this video isn't here to motivate you. It's here to explain why, from that moment on, the world hasn't felt the same to you, and why you haven't reacted to life the same way since. Stay with me. Let's name the moment most people try to forget. Not the dramatic version. Not the story you tell others. The real one. The night when your body was exhausted, but your mind refused to shut down. When silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt interrogative. Like every failure, every loss, every mistake was lined up in front of you, waiting to be judged. This wasn't sadness. Sadness passes. This was the kind of pressure that compresses you from the inside, the kind that makes your chest feel tight for no clear reason, the kind that whispers questions with no good answers. What if nothing changes? What if this is as far as I go? What if all of this effort has been for nothing? Your nervous system was in survival mode. Biologically, you were designed to react in one of three ways: collapse, attack, or disconnect. That's what most people do. They lash out. They shut down. They numb themselves until they can't feel the weight anymore. And no one would have blamed you if you did the same, because that night wasn't fair. You were carrying more than you should have had to carry alone. There was no guarantee of relief. No promise that help was coming. No sign that endurance would be rewarded. This is the part people misunderstand about trauma. Trauma isn't just what happened to you. Trauma is the moment you realize that no one is coming to save you, and you have to decide who you're going to be anyway. That night, something inside you reached a breaking point, not a loud one, a quiet, internal one. You stood at a psychological crossroads. On one side, bitterness, resentment, emotional armor, tools that work, but at a cost. On the other, staying open, staying intact, staying human, without any guarantee that it would protect you. Most people don't even recognize this moment when it happens. They just feel different afterward, harder, more distant, less trusting. But you remember it. Because something in you knew whatever choice you made that night was going to shape you for the rest of your life. And that's where this story actually begins. What matters most about that night isn't how much it hurt. Pain alone doesn't change people. What changes people is how they respond when pain removes all illusions. Biologically, your system was prepared to do what it has done for millions of years: protect itself at all costs. That means hardening. That means closing. That means choosing emotional armor over vulnerability. From a survival perspective, that response would have been correct. But you didn't fully follow it. You felt the pull, the urge to become colder, sharper, more guarded. The temptation to tell yourself, From now on, I won't care. To cut off hope before hope could hurt you again. That would have made sense. No one would have questioned it. And yet something in you paused. Not because you felt strong, not because you had clarity, but because abandoning your inner code felt like a deeper kind of loss. So instead of turning outward in anger, you turned inward in awareness. Instead of numbing yourself, you stayed present with the discomfort. Instead of rewriting your identity around the wound, you refused to let the wound decide who you would become. This is the part most people miss. Your response wasn't dramatic. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't even optimistic. It was precise. You didn't deny the darkness. You didn't romanticize the pain. You didn't pretend everything would be okay. You simply chose not to betray yourself. That decision runs against instinct, against conditioning, against what trauma usually teaches. Trauma trains people to survive by shrinking, by lowering expectations, by reducing emotional exposure. But in that moment, you did something psychologically rare. You held your core steady while everything around it destabilized. You allowed the pain to exist without letting it dictate your values. You allowed the fear to speak without obeying it. You allowed uncertainty without surrendering your sense of meaning. That is not a learned skill. That is not something you copy from a book or a teacher. It's a trait that only reveals itself under pressure. Most people never see it in themselves because they never stay conscious long enough inside the storm. You did, and from that point forward, something shifted. You didn't become softer. You didn't become naive. You became harder to break. Not because you built thicker walls, but because you stopped outsourcing your identity to circumstances. You may not have had language for it then, but that night you crossed a line. And once that line is crossed, there is no returning to who you were before. To understand why your reaction was rare, we need to stop thinking in symbols and start looking at how the human mind actually works. When pressure becomes extreme, the brain does not care about values. It does not care about meaning. It does not care about who you want to be. It cares about one thing only: survival. At that point, control shifts away from conscious thinking and moves into older, faster systems in the brain. Systems designed to keep you alive, not to keep you whole. This is why, under trauma, most people react in predictable ways. Some collapse. They shut down. They lose energy, motivation, and connection. Some become aggressive. Anger gives a temporary sense of control. It feels powerful, but it hardens the personality. Most people dissociate. They disconnect emotionally. They keep functioning, but something essential goes numb. These responses are common for a reason. They work in the short term. What makes your response different is that you didn't fully choose any of them. You felt the urge to shut down, but you stayed present. You felt the pull toward anger, but you didn't let it define you. You felt the temptation to go numb, but you didn't abandon awareness. From a psychological perspective, this matters. It means the part of your brain responsible for self-reflection, values, and long-term identity stayed online longer than it normally does under that level of stress. That almost never happens by accident. Usually it requires training, structure, years of deliberate work. But you didn't have that, which means this capacity didn't come from technique. It came from how you are built. Some people have an internal structure that allows them to experience intense emotion without fragmenting. They can feel pain without becoming it. They can feel fear without surrendering their identity to it. This isn't about being better than others. It's not about being special. It's about integration. Most people, when pushed far enough, reorganize around defense, around protection, around closing off. You reorganized around coherence. You didn't become unbreakable. You became internally consistent. And that changes everything. Because once your sense of self is anchored internally, external chaos loses its grip. This is why, after that night, certain things stopped working on you. Manipulation feels obvious. Emotional games fall flat. Crisis no longer automatically creates panic. Not because you stopped feeling, but because you stopped being controlled. That night, without realizing it, you chose presence over reflex, clarity over collapse, and self-respect over survival at any cost. And that choice is rare, because most people survive. Very few stay intact while doing it. Now we need to be precise about language, because the phrase chosen one has been distorted, romanticized, and turned into fantasy. So let's strip it down to what it actually means. Without comfort, without mythology, without illusions. A chosen one is not someone who is protected from pain. A chosen one is someone who was exposed to enough pressure to reveal what they are made of. You weren't chosen because you are pure. You weren't chosen because you are gifted. And you weren't chosen because you were favored. You were chosen because you did not become corrupt when corruption would have been understandable. Most people, when subjected to sustained pressure, adapt by lowering their standards. They justify behaviors they once despised. They call it realism. They call it maturity. They call it survival. But it's erosion. Chosen ones don't escape this pressure. They face it repeatedly. The difference is not that they suffer more. The difference is that they don't allow suffering to rewrite their internal code. This is the dark version of the identity. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't feel special. And it doesn't come with applause. In fact, it often comes with isolation. Because when you refuse to play by corrupted rules, you become difficult to place. People can't predict you. They can't manipulate you the way they manipulate others. And that makes them uncomfortable. So you get labeled. Too intense, too distant, too serious, too different. Not because you are those things, but because you don't bend in ways that make others feel safe. This is why the chosen one path feels lonely. Not because you are superior, but because you are incompatible with systems built on compromise. And here's the part most people don't understand. Being a chosen one doesn't mean you trust more. It means you see more and still choose integrity. It doesn't mean you are optimistic. It means you are clear-eyed. It doesn't mean you believe everything will work out. It means you are willing to do what's required even if it doesn't. This is not an identity you claim. It's an identity that is revealed by how you behave when no one is watching and no reward is guaranteed. You don't get this role by wanting it. You get it by surviving situations that were designed to degrade you without letting them deform you. And that's why this identity carries weight. Because once you see yourself this way, you can't go back to unconscious participation. You notice manipulation immediately. You feel dishonesty in your body. You recognize systems that require you to shrink in order to belong. And you walk away. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. That's the shadow truth of the chosen one. Not chosen to be admired, chosen to remain intact in a world that quietly rewards those who aren't. And once that identity locks in, your life stops being about comfort. It becomes about alignment. And alignment is not gentle, but it is real. After that internal shift, something subtle begins to happen. Not all at once, not in dramatic ways, but consistently. Things that once controlled you start losing leverage. This isn't because life suddenly becomes easier. It's because the mechanisms that used to pull you off center no longer find the same access points. Before, your reactions were predictable. Certain words could hook you. Certain behaviors could provoke you. Certain situations could destabilize you. And predictability is what systems feed on. Once your identity stopped being negotiated by pressure, that predictability disappeared. People who relied on emotional reactions found less to work with. Manipulation doesn't vanish. It just becomes obvious. Guilt doesn't disappear. It just stops being effective. Fear doesn't leave. It simply stops making decisions for you. This is the first quiet consequence. You become harder to move without becoming rigid. Then something else begins to shift. Situations that once drained you start resolving themselves, not because you fixed them, but because you no longer sustain them. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity from people who benefit from confusion. And without your participation, certain dynamics collapse on their own. This can feel disorienting at first. When chaos has been constant, stability feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Your nervous system needs time to adjust to the absence of constant threat. This is why some people, after growth, mistake calm for emptiness. But it isn't emptiness. It's space. Space where you're no longer bracing. Space where you're no longer scanning for impact. Space where your attention comes back to you. And with that space, perception sharpens. You start noticing patterns you couldn't see before. You see who respects boundaries and who only respected access. You see which opportunities require self-betrayal and which ones don't. You see where your energy multiplies and where it only gets consumed. This isn't luck, and it isn't punishment. It's alignment doing its work. When your internal structure stabilizes, external reality begins reorganizing around it. Not to reward you, but to match you. This is the part people misinterpret. They think things are working out because they did something right. What's actually happening is that fewer things are able to stay misaligned in your presence. And misalignment cannot survive indefinitely without your cooperation. So things fall away. Some relationships, some roles, some paths you once thought you needed, not because you rejected them, but because they no longer recognize you. This is why it feels like your life changed direction without a clear decision. You didn't force a shift. You became someone who could no longer be carried by what was never meant to last. And once that happens, the movement forward is not dramatic. It's inevitable. After alignment, momentum appears, not because life becomes generous, but because resistance decreases. This is where people make dangerous assumptions. They hear the word acceleration and imagine ease, comfort, reward. That's not what this is. Acceleration doesn't mean fewer challenges. It means less confusion about which challenges matter. You move faster because you hesitate less. You decide faster because you no longer need external validation. You let go faster because you recognize dead ends earlier. The path narrows, and a narrow path feels intense. When things begin to accelerate, what's unresolved rises to the surface quickly. Old patterns don't fade slowly anymore. They demand resolution. Avoidance becomes uncomfortable. Half-truths feel heavy. Staying misaligned drains you faster than before. This is why acceleration can feel destabilizing at first. You're no longer allowed the luxury of drifting. The margin for self-betrayal shrinks. What used to take years to teach you a lesson now teaches it in weeks, sometimes days. This isn't punishment, it's efficiency. Life stops repeating itself once you demonstrate that you're paying attention. Opportunities begin to appear, not in abundance, but in precision. Fewer options, clearer consequences. You're not asked to do more. You're asked to be exact. Exact with your energy. Exact with your commitments. Exact with your integrity. And yes, things can move faster on the outside. Decisions finalize quickly. Doors close cleanly. Others open without resistance. But the internal demand increases. You are held to a higher standard, not by life, but by yourself. You feel immediately when something is off. You can't ignore it anymore. This is the trade. Acceleration gives you momentum, but it removes excuses. You don't get to move fast and remain unconscious. You don't get clarity without responsibility. This phase isn't comfortable, but it is honest. And honesty has a kind of speed to it. Once you stop lying to yourself, life no longer needs to slow you down to get your attention. So yes, things accelerate, but not to make you happy. They accelerate because you are finally capable of keeping up with the truth. This is where the message needs to slow down, because clarity, if misunderstood, can turn into arrogance. Nothing you've heard so far makes you superior. Nothing here places you above anyone else. If anything, it places you under greater responsibility. Understanding yourself this way is not a badge, it's a burden. Because once you see clearly, you no longer have the excuse of ignorance. You don't get to act recklessly and call it authenticity. You don't get to dismiss others and call it being awake. And you don't get to avoid the work by hiding behind identity. This path doesn't give you permission to judge. It gives you the obligation to regulate yourself. The danger is subtle. Ego doesn't always show up as pride. Sometimes it shows up as isolation, as believing no one can understand you, as quietly assuming your pain makes you exceptional. That's a trap. Your experiences shaped you, but they don't exempt you from humility. The reason this path is rare is not because others are weak. It's because sustained integrity under pressure is difficult. And the moment you turn this identity into a reason to feel above others, you lose the very thing that made it real. Strength without humility becomes rigidity. Awareness without compassion becomes coldness. Clarity without restraint becomes control. This isn't about being chosen. It's about staying clean in how you move through the world. So if you recognize yourself in this message, let it ground you, not inflate you. Because the more aware you become, the more carefully you have to live. That is the cost, and that is the responsibility. If this message reached you, it wasn't accidental. Most people would have clicked away by now. You didn't. That tells me something about how you process truth. This channel is not for motivation, it's not for comfort, and it's not for entertainment. It's for those who recognize patterns before they are explained. If you felt seen instead of flattered, grounded instead of inflated, quiet instead of excited, then you already know why you're here. Subscribing is not about support. It's about alignment. When you subscribe, you're locking yourself into a standard. No illusions, no spiritual cosplay, no borrowed identity. Only pressure, clarity, and responsibility. If you're not ready for that, don't subscribe, but if you are, if you know this path doesn't get easier, only cleaner, then stay. More will be revealed.